Analysis are you looking at it?
So one of the things I've been thinking like a lot about is like so there's this concept of what we call institutional health, where it's basically within a society, how well are the most important institutions working? So if you're looking at the institutional health of the American system, you're going to be looking at government, you're going to be looking at academia, you're going to be looking at business, journalism, bunch of other things, the military. And so like in general, are these things good at their jobs? Do they get sensible outcomes? And like you can see that like when you get peaks of institutional health, like in like the middle of the 20th century, as you start landing on the moon, you start building interstate highway systems, a lot of stuff starts happening. So when I was saying this like 10 years ago, it was like a lot more controversial. These days, a lot fewer people argue when I claim that institutional health in America has been slowly declining for the last few decades. And like, we're now sort of starting to really see some of the seams starting to fray. So the thing here that I've been thinking about a lot.
Well, first, what would be the symbols of that fray? Just so we're defining terms here. When you say that it looks like these institutions are fraying, how do you know?
Yeah, so one of the examples that gets used a lot, which I think is very striking because it's a very sort of visible thing that you can just look at, is so here in San Francisco, you know, we have the Golden Gate Bridge. And not too long ago, there was a new on-ramp to the bridge that was built, which cost more money, inflation adjusted, and took longer to build than the actual bridge. To stay within the realm of construction, we have this big high-speed rail that like $10 billion or whatever was spent on to build in California. And like we got like some track in the middle of nowhere, but nothing actually got built near any of the cities it's supposed to connect. And if you compare this to building out the interstate highway system, if you compare this to like, so like a much smaller example that I like to use. So I'm based in Oakland. I'm pretty close to Lake Merritt, which is this artificial lake that we have here, which in the, I think it was like the early 1900s, maybe they just decided there should be a lake and they dug it out. And it's absolutely beautiful, wonderful place. It's also now like this wildlife sanctuary. All the birds come to nest, and you're not allowed to change anything about it at all. And so like the attitude that led to the construction of this glorious landmark, which people have to preserve, you would not be allowed to do because of this idea of how we have to preserve the things. So like sticking with the construction because it's very visible, you can see if you have the high-speed rail, like you see it a lot there. You also see it with like, you know, if you compare the rollout of how a lot of the, you know, response to the coronavirus pandemic is to the smallpox eradication campaign or the polio eradication campaigns of the mid-century. Like it doesn't really look for that good in comparison when you look at the sort of institutional bureaucratic trying to roll it out. When you look at the actual science of the vaccines, we're way ahead on physical technology, of course. You can see this in like the foreign policy where we're like, you know, we've been fighting all of these wars in the Middle East for decades, and it's not really clear what we're doing there or why, or if we're going to win, or what it would even mean to win. Whereas, like, you know, if you go back to the 40s, the 50s, we can win wars, we can occupy South Korea, we can occupy Japan. That ends up going great for the places that we end up occupying.
So does this mean the people in positions of power in these things are like play acting? They're like pretending, or they're just not as effective? Or how would you describe why this is occurring?
I think it's because doing this stuff is very, very, very hard. And the knowledge of how to do this is like quite technical, and it's quite easy for it to be lost. So the people who are at these relative peaks of institutional health knew how to get along with each other. They knew how to, you know, navigate the bureaucracies. They knew how to train their replacements. That's a really big one that people aren't nearly as good at or putting as much attention into. They knew how to make deals between like internal subcultures that have really different norms. They knew how to like, defer to the correct authorities. They knew how to respect things going through the right channels, but also pay attention to things outside the channels when you needed to. This is really hard to do. And as the people who knew how to do that have retired or died, in this case, their replacements were often just not as good at those things. And so it's not that they're play acting. I think they're trying as best they can. And they're doing, like, by the standards of sort of world history, they're like doing pretty okay. So in terms of like how good are these people, we've sort of regressed to the mean.
Oh man, that is super interesting, because to think that basically all governments work in this way, and this is just kind of where it generally gets to. But every once in a while, you can have a golden age where things are going well, people learn, you can extend it if you can pass along that information. That makes total sense to me. And you can actually, I remember when I studied under a Chinese professor in graduate school, and he told me that one of the biggest consequences of the one-child policy was actually that culture was not passed down in the same way, and that young people didn't learn how to disagree with one another, and they didn't learn how to look each other in the eye or how to handle conflict. And so he was like, once that became instantiated in the society, and then you add in the internet, that was a major cultural shift for China. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's just them. But I think that's occurring right now. Like there are times when I'm like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to hear his voice. I'm just going to text him this bad news, knowing for a fact that calling somebody and having an actual discussion greases the gears a lot better. And if you think about that on an institutional level, that happening millions and millions and millions of times a day, you can see why that decay would happen.
Yeah, and I'm like kind of worried about what's going to happen as we run out of the last of our sort of reserves of baby boomers. And power, like I think power is going to pretty much skip over Generation X for the most part, and millennials are going to come into most of the influential positions. And I think that might cause some problems, because I think there's a lot of this stuff that the boomers know how to do that most millennials don't.